He reached across the table and took the remote. The television shut off mid-sentence. The room went silent. He stood up and blocked my view. He pointed at the door. He told me to leave his house. My name is Janet. I am 60 years old. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heart-warming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. And drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. I was sitting upright on the edge of the couch, not leaning back, not relaxed, watching a program I had already missed half of, careful not to touch the pillows, careful not to seem too comfortable in a home my daughter called hers, but never called mine. The screen had been the only sound in the room, filling the space where conversation no longer lived. And when it went dark, the silence felt official, like a decision had already been signed. My son-in-law did not explain himself. He did not argue. He did not look at my face. He looked past me as if I were already gone. The remote stayed in his hand, firm, deliberate, final. In the kitchen, my daughter stood with her back turned, running water over an empty sink, performing noise instead of truth. No one asked where I would go. No one said my name. I stood slowly, my knees stiff, my movements measured, because dignity was the only thing still fully mine. I reached for my coat from the chair near the door, the same chair I was never invited to sit on. As I walked through the living room, I noticed the framed photos lining the wall: holidays, birthdays, smiles carefully staged, and I was absent from all of them. I had helped when money was tight. I had watched children when schedules were full. I had stayed quiet when respect was optional. Now I was being removed with a gesture. He opened the door. Cold air entered first. I stepped outside without protest, because I understood something in that moment that they did not. What happened in that room was not small, and what followed would not be quiet. The door closed behind me without hesitation. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the lock turn from the inside, slow and deliberate, as if to make sure I understood the message. The night air was sharp, cutting through my coat, and the street was empty in a way that felt intentional, like the world had stepped back to watch. I did not knock. I did not turn around. I walked down the steps one at a time, steady, controlled, carrying myself the way I had been taught when pride was the only thing no one could take. My phone sat heavy in my pocket. I did not reach for it. I knew who would answer and who would not. The house lights stayed on as I walked away, warm and bright for everyone except me. With every step, pieces of my life replayed in fragments: rides I had given, bills I had covered quietly, weekends I had surrendered without being asked. None of that mattered now. On the sidewalk, I stopped beneath a streetlight that flickered like it was deciding whether I was worth seeing. Cars passed without slowing. Windows stayed dark. I realized then how quickly a person could be erased when convenience outweighed respect. I had not raised my daughter to turn her back on me, but I had raised her to trust the man she married, and that trust had just been used as a weapon. I checked the time. It was late enough to be unsafe, early enough to be remembered. I chose not to call a friend, not to ask for help, because I needed to understand the shape of this moment clearly, without comfort blurring the truth. As I walked, I felt something settle in me, cold, firm, unmovable. That living room scene was not a misunderstanding. It was a test, and somewhere behind that locked door, they believed they had passed it. They were wrong. I walked through the empty streets, each step echoing louder than the last, the distant hum of traffic, like a drum marking time against my heartbeat. Shadows stretched long across cracked sidewalks, and every corner seemed ready to swallow me if I slowed. I thought about the house, the warmth I had built with my own hands in moments no one noticed, the quiet sacrifices that never earned a single word of thanks. My son-in-law's face haunted me, calm, decisive, like a judge delivering a sentence without trial. How easily he had reduced decades of presence into nothing more than an inconvenience. I remembered the way my daughter had not intervened, the way she had hidden behind the kitchen counter, pretending to rinse a cup, pretending not to see, pretending that my existence could be paused and ignored. It was not just rejection, it was erasure. Every step I took felt heavier, weighed down by the injustice that had no name, by the cold truth that the people I loved could weaponize their own comfort against me. My coat did little against the night air, and I pulled it tighter, not for warmth, but for armor. A distant siren wailed, cutting through the quiet, and I knew the world did not care that I had been pushed out, that dignity had been dismissed, that trust had been betrayed. I reached a small park, its empty benches lined like silent witnesses, and I sat, letting my thoughts sharpen, letting the anger rise slow and steady, cold and precise. The betrayal was not random. It had been rehearsed in subtle gestures, the pause of conversation, the way eyes averted mine, the small decisions that accumulated until a single act of dismissal could feel like an execution. I clenched my hands in my lap, imagining the walls of that house, the locked doors, the laughter I had once helped create now hollow, turned against me. And as I sat there, in darkness under a flickering lamp, I realized one truth with chilling clarity. No one would offer justice. No one would see the harm done. And if I wanted it to be remembered, if I wanted the balance restored, it would have to be me who acted, quietly, deliberately, and without mercy. The night whispered possibilities, and I listened carefully, because this was only the beginning. I did not go home that night. Instead, I walked through the city streets as if I were invisible, watching lives continue around me with a careless indifference that stung sharper than any words could. Streetlights flickered over cracked asphalt, and shadows from empty buildings reached like fingers clutching at my coat, reminding me of the void they had tried to put me in. Every step echoed with the memory of that living room, the finality in my son-in-law's gesture, the cold precision in his eyes, the way my daughter had stayed silent, complicit in her own family's betrayal. It was not anger that surged inside me. It was something colder, more exact, a sharpened awareness that everything I had built in patience and love could be dismissed in a single breath. I thought of the property in Los Angeles, the house I had contributed to, maintained silently, paid for with my own savings, only to watch it slip through hands addicted to desire and recklessness. My son-in-law, I realized, did not just see me as an obstacle. He saw me as a threat, a reminder of accountability he refused to acknowledge. I felt the weight of every step I had taken, every favor I had quietly done, every quiet hour sacrificed, and how none of it mattered now. My mind traced plans with the clarity of ice, the doors, the locks, the documents, the people who would turn a blind eye because they believed comfort excused complicity. The night air grew sharper with every block, filling my lungs with determination, not fear. Somewhere in the city, life continued as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. I knew the quiet work that had gone unseen would have its reckoning. The betrayal had a pattern, and patterns could be traced, exploited. I had been pushed out of a home, humiliated without sound, treated like air that could be displaced and forgotten. But the displacement had left a mark, a shadow that followed him in them, unnoticed yet inevitable. And as I walked into the darker corners of the city, where streetlights dared not linger, I realized that night would be the first step, not of retaliation, but of observation, patience, and the cold, slow justice that only someone who had nothing left to lose could wield. Something had begun, and it would not end quietly. By the time I returned to my small apartment, the city had settled into a deceptive calm, a quiet that masked danger and deceit in equal measure. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and dust, reminders that this place was mine, temporary though it felt, and safe only because no one else wanted it. I locked the door behind me, the click echoing like a warning, a barrier against the world that had just proven how easily it could discard me. I sank into the worn chair by the window, watching the streets below, where life continued in careless indifference. Cars passing, lights flickering, a man laughing alone on a stoop, and felt the bitterness of absence settle deep into my bones. That living room, those polished floors, the smell of warm bread and detergent, the way my son-in-law had stood tall and absolute while I was dismissed like refuse, replayed in my mind with surgical clarity. Every gesture, every glance, every inch of space he had taken by force became a blueprint of his arrogance, of his belief that wealth and control entitled him to erase me. I thought of my daughter, of the way she had stood silently, watching, colluding in her own mother's erasure, of the way family bonds could twist into weapons in the hands of those too weak to wield truth. And then I thought of the property, the house in Los Angeles, once a symbol of security, now a pawn in my son's descent into addiction, carelessly liquidated for the fleeting high of his habit. The thought ignited something darker inside me, a clarity that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with survival, with reclamation, with justice measured in cold precision. I began tracing every step, every legal document, every signature, every moment where negligence had met opportunity and created the chaos that had expelled me. Outside, the night pressed against the windows like judgment, indifferent yet perfect in its timing. I realized that patience was now my only weapon, observation my only shield. This was no longer a story of humiliation. It was a calculation, slow and deliberate, each thought a move on a board where they had already assumed victory. They had underestimated me, assumed my silence was submission. They were wrong, and in the quiet dark of my apartment, under the watchful eye of the city's indifferent lights, I began to plan, not revenge born of impulse, but a reckoning measured, inevitable, and terrifying in its precision. Something had been taken from me, and it would be restored, piece by piece, in ways they would not see coming, because the world did not prepare for a woman who had already lost everything. The next morning, I returned to the streets before anyone was awake, moving silently through alleys and empty sidewalks as if I were invisible, blending into the gray light that did not yet claim the city. Every face I passed was unaware of the storm gathering in me, of the weight I carried from a living room turned battlefield, a family home that had become a courtroom where I was judged and dismissed without trial. I thought of the Los Angeles property, sold like an object, pawned for drugs, a betrayal that stretched across miles and years of quiet sacrifice. My son's addiction had not just destroyed his life, it had rewritten mine, turning stability into uncertainty, trust into weaponized weakness, and love into leverage. I traced the path in my mind like a map. Every transaction, every conversation, every signature that allowed the house to vanish into someone else's hands. My daughter's silence was sharper than any word, a betrayal she wore like armor, protecting her husband while erasing the mother who had given everything to raise her. I felt the cold clarity of reality settling over me. The world did not reward patience. The world did not honor quiet service. The world allowed the reckless to thrive, while those who acted with integrity were erased with a gesture, a glance, a turned key. I passed a row of shuttered shops, their windows reflecting fragments of my face, worn and determined, and realized that every wrong done to me had created a ledger in my mind, a record of debts unpaid. The plan began to take shape, not out of anger, but from a precise understanding that actions left consequences, and consequences could be directed, controlled, wielded as tools. I did not need anyone's permission. I did not need anyone's sympathy. I needed only clarity, patience, and the cold execution of foresight. By the time the sun rose fully over the city, washing the streets with light that offered no comfort, I had made decisions that would ripple through that family in ways they could not yet imagine. The doors they thought closed were just openings for observation. The silence they had forced was just preparation. And as I turned a corner into the early hum of the city awakening, I knew that the reckoning was already in motion, subtle, unstoppable, and destined to reshape everything they had believed unshakable. By mid-morning, I was back near the edge of the city, where offices and apartments rose like walls of glass and steel, reflecting lives built on control, wealth, and appearances, the very illusions my son-in-law had used to justify his actions. I walked slowly, deliberately, each footstep measured, my mind mapping every connection, every detail, every vulnerability in the chain that had allowed him to sell the Lowe's Angels property for his addiction. It was not anger that drove me. Anger is fleeting and soft. This was precision, a cold, deliberate acknowledgement of how easily people could be manipulated when they assumed nothing would follow. I recalled the day I had first invested in that home, the hours spent negotiating, the sweat and patience required to ensure security for my family, and how all of that had been obliterated by reckless choices and silence. My daughter's absence from confrontation haunted me, the way she had stood in the kitchen, washing nothing, hearing everything, letting the man she married act as if he owned the law itself. It was betrayal at its finest, subtle, quiet, and perfectly executed to humiliate me without confrontation. I passed a cafe, its doors reflecting my face, haggard but unbroken, and I traced every document, every legal loophole, every trusted signature that had made the property vanish from my hands. Each step through the city streets sharpened my resolve. They had assumed that wealth, youth, and addiction gave them immunity, that arrogance and control could erase me. They were wrong. Every misstep, every act of carelessness, every moment they believed I was out of sight was now logged in my mind, ready to be transformed into leverage, observation, and calculated action. By noon, the city was alive with sound, but I moved as if the noise were irrelevant, the chatter and movement beneath me only background to the meticulous plotting forming in my mind. This was no longer about being pushed out of a living room. This was about reclaiming what had been taken, making them understand that silence and betrayal could not exist without consequence, and that a woman who had nothing left to lose could wield patience and precision like a weapon sharper than any raised hand. And as I turned toward the shadowed streets that would become my route of observation, I knew with chilling certainty they had lit the fire, and I would be the one to control how it consumed everything they thought untouchable. That afternoon, I sat in a public library where no one noticed anyone, the kind of place where silence carried weight and time slowed to a crawl. I chose a seat near the back, my coat still on, posture straight, eyes steady, watching reflections in the glass more than the pages in front of me. Names surfaced in my mind with uncomfortable clarity: bank officers who smiled too much, agents who rushed paperwork, relatives who asked questions only when money was involved. I replayed conversations I had dismissed years ago as harmless, now hearing the pauses, the eagerness, the careful avoidance of specifics. Patterns emerged. The sale of the Lowe's Angels property had not been a single reckless act. It had been enabled, smoothed, protected by people who assumed I would never push back. I wrote nothing down. I did not need notes. Every detail lodged itself where it would not be forgotten. Outside, rain began without warning, tapping against the windows like a countdown. I thought of my son's addiction, not as an excuse, but as a doorway others had walked through willingly, each step justified by profit and convenience. I thought of my son-in-law's confidence, the way he had stood in that living room as if authority were his by default, as if erasing me carried no cost. The library clock moved with indifference. I stayed still, letting the truth settle fully, letting denial fall away. By the time the rain stopped, I understood the scope of what had been done and who had benefited. I stood, returned the unused book, and stepped back onto the street with a clarity that felt final. This was not about confrontation. This was about timing. They believed the story had ended the moment I stepped outside their door. They believed distance meant safety. As I merged into the crowd, unnoticed and underestimated, I made a quiet promise to myself. The next time my name was spoken in their house, it would not be followed by silence. It would be followed by consequences they had already signed for whether they realized it yet or not. That evening, I stood across the street from their house, partially hidden by the shadow of a bare tree, watching the windows light up one by one, as if nothing in their world had shifted. Curtains moved. A television flickered back to life. Dinner plates were carried from counter to table. Routine had resumed, clean and undisturbed, built on the assumption that what happened earlier meant nothing beyond a moment of discomfort. I stayed still, not out of fear, but out of study. The house looked different from the outside, smaller, more fragile, its strength dependent on doors that locked and locks that could be challenged in ways they had never considered. I watched my son-in-law move through the living room, relaxed, certain, his body language free of doubt. He had already erased me from the narrative, already rewritten the day as necessary, justified, complete. My daughter passed behind him, her face unreadable through the glass, her silence now permanent, not temporary. I counted the seconds between lights turning off, the rhythm of their habits, the predictability they mistook for control. I thought of the documents I had once reviewed, the signatures placed without care, the trust given without protection, and how easily that trust had been converted into leverage for others. The night air pressed in, heavy and cold, and I felt no urgency, no impulse to act. This was the advantage they had unknowingly handed me: time, observation, and their absolute certainty that I no longer mattered. A car passed. I did not move. A neighbor walked by with a dog. I did not move. Their world continued, insulated by ignorance. When the last light went out and the house fell dark, I turned away, not because I was finished, but because I had learned enough for now. They believed the danger had passed. They believed comfort meant safety. They were wrong. What they had done was not hidden. It was simply waiting to be acknowledged. And acknowledgement, I knew, would arrive when they were least prepared to receive it. I spent the night awake, not restless, not afraid, but alert, sitting at my small table with the lights off, letting the city glow filter in through the blinds like a reminder that nothing stays hidden forever. The silence gave me room to think clearly, to replay every detail without distortion. The sale of the Lowe's Angels property rushed through channels that should have raised questions. The signatures accepted without proper verification. The confidence with which my son-in-law moved, as if rules bent naturally in his favor. I realized then that what protected him was not intelligence, but assumption. People assumed I would not challenge him. They assumed age meant compliance. They assumed silence meant agreement. I reviewed old files from memory, conversations once casual now precise, names connected by timing rather than loyalty. My daughter's role became clearer in that quiet. Not innocent, not aggressive, convenient. She had learned how to survive by standing still while others acted, letting outcomes form around her without taking responsibility for their shape. That understanding settled heavily, not with pain, but with finality. Near dawn, I stepped outside onto the fire escape and watched the city shift colors, gray giving way to pale light, buildings revealing their flaws under honesty. I knew then I would not confront them with words. Words invite defense. I would let systems speak instead, let records surface, let questions be asked by people whose interest could not be dismissed. They believed they had removed me from the equation. In reality, they had freed me from restraint. As the first morning traffic began to move below, I closed my eyes and made one decision that could not be reversed. The next call I made would not be to family. It would be to someone whose job was to look closely at things others preferred to rush past. And once that call was made, nothing about their comfort would remain untouched by mid-morning. I was seated at a small cafe near the financial district, my presence unnoticed among the early risers, the business suits, the coffee cups clinking, the newspapers rustling. I observed everything, cataloged every detail, the way people moved, the patterns of attention and neglect, the signals that indicated who acted with care and who acted recklessly. My mind replayed the living room scene repeatedly. The remote lifted like a gavel, the command delivered without hesitation, the door pointed to as if the act itself were sufficient explanation. I remembered every face that had ignored me, every glance that pretended I did not exist, every subtle action that had allowed my son-in-law to liquidate our Lowe's Angels property without challenge. I thought of the documents, the gaps, the weak verifications, the blind trust placed in hands that should never have been trusted. The air in the cafe smelled of fresh bread and espresso, almost warm, almost inviting, but I felt only calculation. Each patron, each server, each movement became part of the larger picture. The sale had not been an accident. It had been enabled. I traced the chain again in my mind, step by step, person by person, by timing. I saw opportunities that had been ignored, doors left unlocked, systems abused through assumption. I felt no anger, only focus, cold, deliberate, precise. The betrayal of family, the erosion of trust, the erasure of presence, all of it had created patterns I could exploit, channels I could trace, weaknesses I could turn to my advantage. The world did not care that I had been humiliated. They believed that silence meant compliance. They believed absence meant submission. They were wrong. And as the morning sun grew, slanting through the windows onto the polished table in front of me, I made decisions in my mind that would set everything in motion. Calls to be made, people to be observed, actions to be triggered in sequence. All silent, all deliberate, all invisible until the consequences struck. By the time I left the cafe, I was no longer simply a mother who had been dismissed. I was a presence calculated, patient, and inevitable, a force that would arrive where they least expected. And when it did, it would leave nothing untouched by afternoon. I was seated in a quiet office building lobby where voices were lowered and doors closed softly, the kind of place where decisions were made without emotion and consequences were filed neatly under procedure. I watched people pass through security with confidence born from routine, the same routine that had protected my son-in-law when he acted without consequence. I thought again of the Lowe's Angels property, how easily it had changed hands, how quickly value became vapor once greed and addiction entered the room. My son's name sat heavy in my thoughts, not as a memory of who he was, but as evidence of how far he had fallen and how many were willing to benefit from that fall. Addiction had made him predictable. Predictability had made him useful. I understood then that none of this was hidden. It was simply ignored because acknowledging it required effort and integrity. I felt the weight of time pressing in, not urgent, but insistent. Each hour that passed without action was an hour they believed proved their safety. I remained still, listening to fragments of conversation, noting schedules, habits, the subtle arrogance of people who believed rules bent in their favor. I imagined the moment questions would be asked, the sudden discomfort when certainty cracked and explanations were required. My daughter's silence echoed again, not as confusion, but as alignment, a choice she had made long before the television went dark. I felt no need to confront her. Truth did not require permission to surface. When I finally stood and walked back into the street, the city felt sharper, louder, more exposed. I realized the distance between what they believed and what was real had grown dangerously wide. They thought time was on their side. They thought age had slowed me. They thought I would fade. As I blended into the moving crowd, unnoticed and unchallenged, I knew the final phase had begun. And when it ended, no one would be able to say they were surprised. That night, I reviewed everything again in silence, not because I doubted myself, but because precision demands repetition. I sat by the window with the lights off, watching reflections move across the glass, faces appearing and disappearing like reminders of how easily people believe they are unseen. My thoughts returned to the moment I was ordered out, how authority had been claimed without merit, how certainty had replaced decency. That certainty was their weakness. My son-in-law believed control was permanent once displayed. My daughter believed silence could shield her from consequence. My son believed escape could be purchased through addiction and disposal. They were all wrong in different ways. I traced the sequence of events carefully. What happened before the sale? Who benefited immediately? Who ignored questions? Who avoided documentation? Each omission formed a pattern. Each pattern pointed to intent. I did not need confession. I needed alignment, and alignment was already present. The systems they trusted were not broken. They were simply thorough when asked to be. I felt no satisfaction in this realization, only inevitability. The city outside continued its noise, unaware that a quiet recalibration was underway. I understood now that the most dangerous decisions are made calmly, without witnesses, without raised voices. I thought of the house again, the couch, the dark screen, the pointed door, and I recognized that moment for what it truly was, not rejection, but exposure. They had shown me exactly how they operated when they believed power was uncontested, that knowledge was irreversible. When I finally stepped away from the window and prepared for the night, I felt the weight of what was coming settle fully into place. Nothing dramatic would happen tomorrow, nothing visible. That was the point. The machinery had already been engaged, and once it started moving, it would not stop for explanations, apologies, or regret. The following morning, I moved with purpose through the quiet streets before the city fully awoke, the sidewalks empty, except for the occasional courier, or early commuter, unaware of the calculation walking among them. Every step reinforced clarity. Every breath sharpened focus. I thought of the house in Lowe's Angels again, the property now in other hands, sold in a single transaction, fueled by addiction and negligence. The memory of the living room flashed vividly. The remote lifted, the command delivered, the door pointed to, my daughter silent, complicit. That moment had become a blueprint, a lesson in how easily people assume permanence from temporary advantage. I traced the paper trail in my mind, the bank documents, the signatures, the gaps they believed no one would notice, and I saw how fragile their certainty really was. None of this required confrontation. Confrontation was messy, visible, and ultimately predictable. What they failed to account for was patience, observation, and the quiet understanding of leverage. I walked past office buildings, reflecting the pale morning light, and felt the weight of consequences forming around them invisibly, like shadows extending before the sun had fully risen. Each person involved, each ignored detail, each assumption of immunity became a node in a network I now controlled without them knowing it. I remembered the confidence in my son-in-law's eyes, the arrogance in my daughter's silence, the carelessness of the systems that enabled the sale, and I cataloged it all with meticulous attention. By the time the city stirred fully into movement, I had mapped the angles, traced the connections, and prepared the first steps that would force them to confront the reality they had so easily ignored. They believed distance, youth, and addiction had created safety. They were wrong. Every small misstep they had made was now recorded, evaluated, and ready to be turned into leverage, proof, and exposure. And as I merged into the morning crowd, unnoticed, underestimated, I realized that their false sense of security was my most powerful tool. They would learn soon enough that actions taken in darkness do not remain hidden forever, and that the calmest, quietest observer often wields the most irreversible power. By late afternoon, the city felt tighter, louder, as if it sensed pressure building beneath its surface. I walked past familiar streets with unfamiliar awareness, noticing how quickly people trusted routines to protect them. Same doors, same schedules, same assumptions repeated daily, without question. I thought of my son-in-law moving through his life with that same false confidence, believing control was proven once and never tested again. I thought of my daughter choosing comfort over courage, mistaking silence for safety, and I thought of my son, lost to addiction, used as a convenient excuse by everyone who benefited from his collapse. None of them understood what neglect creates when it is finally seen clearly. I paused at a crosswalk, watching the light change, watching people step forward without looking, trusting the signal more than their surroundings. That trust was familiar. It was the same trust I had given once, and the same trust that had been taken apart piece by piece. I realized then how many warnings I had ignored over the years. The rushed conversations, the missing details, the way decisions were made without me, but justified in my name. The television incident had not been sudden. It had been the final symptom of a long, quiet pattern. As I crossed the street, I felt no hesitation, only certainty. The information I held was no longer abstract. It was aligned, ready, waiting for the right moment to surface. They believed I was alone, isolated, without influence. They believed age had narrowed my reach. They believed silence meant surrender. Each belief worked in my favor. When I reached my building and unlocked the door, the sound echoed through the hallway like a marker. A line crossed. I sat down, closed my eyes, and accepted what came next without resistance. This was no longer about reclaiming respect. It was about accountability. And somewhere, without knowing it yet, they were already feeling the first shift, the subtle imbalance that comes just before everything they rely on begins to fail. That night, I made the first call. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain my feelings. I stated facts, dates, amounts, signatures, and absences. On the other end of the line, there was a pause, the kind that only comes when someone realizes a routine matter is no longer routine. I listened carefully, noting the shift in tone, the sudden attention, the questions that had not been asked before. When the call ended, nothing around me changed, and that was how I knew it had worked. I sat in the dark afterward, letting the quiet settle, understanding that systems do not react loudly at first. They begin by watching. I thought of my son-in-law asleep in his bed, confident, unaware that his certainty had just been logged, indexed, and flagged. I thought of my daughter, who believed loyalty meant alignment rather than truth, and how that choice had already placed her in a position she could not step away from. I thought of my son, drifting between need and dependency, surrounded by people who saw opportunity where responsibility should have been. None of them felt the shift yet. That comes later. I reviewed the sequence again, not for reassurance, but for discipline. One call leads to another. One question opens several. Silence invites scrutiny. Outside, the city lights blinked steadily, indifferent to the recalibration underway. I understood then that this was the most dangerous stage, not the confrontation, not the exposure, but the waiting period when nothing appears to happen and everyone assumes safety has been restored. I did not fill that space with doubt. I filled it with patience. By the time I lay down, fully dressed, phone beside me, I accepted the reality without emotion. There was no turning back now. The door they pointed me toward had led somewhere they never considered, and when it finally opened again, it would not be for me to leave. The next morning, I observed from a distance, blending into the world they believed I no longer occupied. From a cafe across the street, I watched their routines, the same movements, the same assumptions, the same false sense of control. My son-in-law moved through the house with that same arrogant ease, unaware that every action he took had been traced, every careless gesture recorded in a ledger I kept in my mind. I watched my daughter follow, silent, complicit, trusting her comfort more than her conscience, never suspecting that silence can be documented and wielded. The Lowe's Angels property flashed through my thoughts again, not as a memory, but as evidence. The hurried signatures, the missing scrutiny, the reckless hands that traded years of work for momentary escape. Outside, the street moved in rhythmic chaos. Delivery trucks, commuters, a man running late. No one noticed the quiet observer, and that was exactly how it should be. Patience had become my weapon, vigilance my shield, and anticipation my strength. I reviewed every potential weakness, the bank, the real estate records, the acquaintances who had enabled, ignored, or stood by. Each vulnerability formed a line of power I could leverage silently, without confrontation, without emotion. They had assumed distance meant safety. They had assumed age meant weakness. They had assumed silence meant submission. They were all wrong. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth remind me of control, not warmth in the sentimental sense, but the kind that comes from knowing the outcome is already in motion. The city outside felt indifferent, but I knew better. Consequences do not require spectacle. They only require precision, timing, and patience. And as I left the cafe, slipping into the unnoticed crowd, I felt the first stirrings of inevitability in the lives of those who had tried to erase me. What they believed was order was already bending toward reckoning, and the quietest observer was now the most unstoppable force in the room they thought they owned by late afternoon. I had mapped every corner of their routines in my mind, every predictable behavior, every overlooked detail, every weak point they relied upon for comfort. I walked near their neighborhood, careful to remain unseen, letting the shadows guide me while the sun fell lower, casting long, distorted shapes across sidewalks and fences. I watched the windows of the house glow in warm, deceptive light, saw my son-in-law pacing, confident, believing that control was permanent, that his authority was absolute. My daughter moved silently, always just behind him, her posture relaxed, her face unreadable, a perfect shield of indifference. I observed the timing of lights, the flick of curtains, the cadence of meals and footsteps, and I cataloged it all like a ledger of vulnerability waiting to be exposed. The sale of the Lowe's Angels property repeated in my mind as a masterclass in carelessness, signatures missed, assumptions unchecked, the ease with which people ignored responsibility in favor of convenience. That recklessness had created a blueprint, and I was tracing it with cold precision. I did not need to act today. I did not need confrontation. I only needed to see, to know, to record. Every choice they had made to ignore, to dismiss, to erase, had left openings I could exploit without raising suspicion. They believed their lives were insulated by arrogance and habit. They were wrong. The quiet, the routine, the predictable, all of it had become mine to wield. I felt the weight of inevitability settle across my shoulders, not like fear, but like the patient pressure of gravity, unrelenting and impartial. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting the streets in orange shadows, I turned and walked away, unseen, underestimated, unnoticed. They believed the threat was gone. They believed distance and obedience had neutralized me, but I had learned every secret, memorized every misstep, and the consequences would arrive in ways they could not anticipate. Precise, relentless, and unavoidable. Night fell, heavy and oppressive, the kind of darkness that makes every shadow sharper, every movement more pronounced. I moved quietly through streets I had walked 100 times, but tonight they felt different, like a stage set for an inevitable reckoning. My thoughts were sharp, focused, circling the events that had led me here, the command to leave, the cold dismissal, my daughter's silence, the reckless sale of the Lowe's Angels property, every detail replayed with clarity, every gap, every overlooked signature, every assumption of safety cataloged in my mind like evidence in a trial no one had yet realized was underway. I watched from a distance as the house's interior glowed warmly, life continuing in ignorance, confidence replacing caution, arrogance hiding vulnerability. I traced their routines in real time, predicting their steps, their pauses, their unguarded moments. They believed the night protected them, that darkness was their ally. They were wrong. Silence had become my weapon, observation my shield, patience my strategy. The betrayal they had committed was precise, and so would be the response. I remembered my son, lost to addiction, and the property sold without scrutiny, and I understood fully that justice was not loud. Justice was methodical, quiet, and unavoidable once set in motion. Every careless move they had made, every act of hubris, every omission, had created openings I could exploit without alerting them. I felt the weight of inevitability settling in, like a tide moving unseen beneath calm waters. This night, like every step I had taken since being dismissed, was not about confrontation. It was about positioning, preparation, and control. By the time I turned away from the lit windows of their home, I knew the moment of reckoning was near. They had assumed my removal meant impotence. That silence meant surrender. They were wrong, and when the consequences arrived, they would have no defense, no warning, and no doubt of the force they had awakened by believing a woman could be erased so easily. The call came in the early morning, calm, professional, unavoidable. Questions were asked that could not be dismissed. Records were reviewed that could not be altered. Explanations were required that could not be improvised. What had been done in silence was now being examined in daylight, stripped of confidence and pretense. The sale of the Lowe's Angels property was no longer a private mistake buried under excuses. It was a documented act with consequences attached. My son-in-law's certainty collapsed first. Authority means nothing when facts replace posture. My daughter's silence followed, no longer protective, no longer useful. And my son, lost, unstable, used, was no longer the shield they hid behind. I did not confront them. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask for apologies. Systems moved the way they were designed to move when truth is introduced without emotion. By the time the process reached its final stage, what had been taken was accounted for. What had been hidden was exposed, and what had been dismissed was restored in form, if not in feeling. I stood alone afterward, not triumphant, not relieved, but steady. The living room scene no longer held power over me. The dark screen, the pointed door, the command to leave, all of it had led here. They believed control was loud. They believed dismissal ended stories. They were wrong. What I learned is simple and permanent. Dignity does not require permission, and silence does not mean weakness. If you found this story entrusting and forgot to do so, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. Thank you for listening, for staying, and for allowing my voice to travel where truth still matters.